Welcome. My name is Cecil Walker,
And my name is Adam Frower.
and this is Possibilities. Today, we're going to be talking about spirituality and faith. And as wide of a range of topics as I think that includes, it might be helpful to start off with just defining things, I think, a bit for us, and then seeing where we go from there. So, what do you make of spirituality? If someone came to you and said, I want to talk about spirituality, what even are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think oftentimes people relate spirituality and religiosity together. And so I think it might be important to kind of like separate those a bit and say, like, what is the difference? At least to me, when I think of religiosity, I think it is about adhering to certain principles, certain practices, involving yourself with various rituals that are in line with a particular religion or denomination or something like that. And so there is oftentimes a community aspect associated with religion. There are prescribed beliefs and practices that if you belong to this religion, these are the things that you adhere to. And I think, again, my own kind of personal understanding is that spirituality is perhaps, the way that I would describe it, is much more broad than that. You may be a religious person and consider yourself also spiritual, but you don't necessarily have to be religious if you consider yourself a spiritual person. I think the way that I've oftentimes heard and talked to people around things like spirituality is oftentimes I found, I guess, kind of along a continuum of myself, my inner self, attending to my spirit, attending to my inner like peace of mind and those kinds of things, kind of on one far extreme, I suppose, all the way to, in some sense, I believe in some supreme being or a divine being, and my spirituality is very much connected to connecting with that being or being in communion with that being. And so I think spirituality can, in that regard, look a lot like religion, potentially, where it's about a relationship with the Supreme, or it could go all the way to, I'm just trying to attend to my own spiritual needs, my own groundedness, my own, and it may have actually nothing to do with God or a supreme being in any way. And so I think it's kind of all along that continuum.
Yeah, I think my understanding overlaps very well with exactly what you were just describing. You referenced religiosity, and it seems like you're saying that's a more organized way of capturing some of these things. But spirituality in and of itself could just be something internal. I think of it as just a meaning-making system that people have for, what's important, what feels like is powerful, where do things come from in terms of what is meaningful and what's directive in your life, if you're looking for purpose and understanding and meaning. So I would say what I thought kind of very much overlaps with what you described so well. I think a good place to start, which might answer a lot of wide range of questions that I think people can have when it comes to spirituality and faith and these types of topics. What is it good for? What does it do for people to have these things? Is there some reason it seems so widespread that so many people have some version of this, whether it's something really organized and communal or something personal and intimate? Why do we have it?
At least here in the United States, I think that so much of our country, so much of our culture was founded on religion. And so I think it's kind of interwoven into everyday life here. And I think that over time, our culture has kind of moved slightly away from religion and more to spirituality. So I think that's a component. I think there's a cultural component. I think there's a time component that adds to that. But I also think that you kind of also threw in there, like, what are the benefits? Like, what do people get out of, like, identifying as a spiritual person? And I think one of the major kind of hallmarks is what I would say is, like, attentiveness. It adds to purpose. You use the word of, like, there's meaning making that happens through these belief systems, through this way of thinking. And I think that meaning making oftentimes is an extension of, like, I feel like there's a purpose to this life. I feel like I have a purpose. There's a role that I need to accomplish, or there are things that are in line with who I am, that if I live according to those things, I could, quote unquote, be a good person. And so I think that it gives us guidance, it gives us direction, it gives us purpose, it gives us kind of a framework with which to make decisions of, like, this is in line with what I see myself doing, and this is out of line with what I see myself doing. And it allows us, I think, to be intentional about how we go about living life.
This reminds me of, I love books that talk about, like, the anthropological developments of things for human beings, and a lot of them will talk about where spirituality and early religions and things like that come from, where in human evolution, where we got to this point where we became so much more conscious and cognitive, and, you know, really separating ourselves from other species and having this higher thinking, suddenly we could talk about, imagine, and interact with things that weren't very physically, explicitly present. We could talk about yesterday, you know, that's almost as fictitious as you know, making up a story about something. But not only that, we could talk about the kind of metaphorical or non-concrete types of meanings in things. We could talk about, you know, the value of being an honorable person. We could talk about, you know, how meaningful nature is and living in harmony with nature. And so all those things you could see kind of coagulate together into a sense of religion or spirituality. And you start to say, well, what does it mean, like you said, to be a good person? I could start to have conversations about that. I could start to have conversations about what's the fullest potential of my life. If I were to live my full potential, what does that mean? Where do I find purpose? How do I know if I've lived a good life, this, you know, in the range of my life? And so that's where I think some early concepts of spirituality and religion start to form. And I think you can also see the answers to this question in that same thing of what good does it do? Because it started to give people purpose, exactly what you described. It started to make sense of the things around us and how we should live our life, and people could be more intentional in living their lives. But another thing that I think that is really, really huge, that was true back then and is still really true now, is it changes how you interact with people, I think, too. Because then it says there is a powerful way, an intentional way of relating to other people. A lot of religions say that we should see each other as the same. We should see each other as equals, and that should allow us to love each other the same way we love ourselves and love the people that are close to us. We should see some shared humanity and something like that. Or there's moral value even in being as good a person as I can to another person. That's something about compassion and kindness really should be embedded in all of my interactions with the world. And that I should be less attached to these non-human, non-empathetic types of pursuits, and much more attached to these more, what can I do for other people types of pursuits. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's because that's a big part of what spirituality and religion can do for people, is make us better community members, make us better relatives to each other.
Yeah, I really appreciate that concept, because I think we are like interactional beings, right? We crave interaction with other people, and I think in some sense spirituality guides how do we relate to each other. So I think it kind of puts guidelines or parameters or, you know, goalposts around, like, this is how you can do that well. But the other thing that came to my mind as you were talking is that in some sense, I was thinking about all of the other topics that we've done through possibilities, right? We've talked about things like productivity and procrastination. We've talked about anxiety. We've talked about like having more confidence and all of those kinds of things. And one of the things that as you were talking kind of occurred to me is having a good sense of spirituality, having this like attentiveness, having this like moral value that kind of undergirds all of that. That's kind of a foundation for a lot of these other principles. If I want to be more productive, engage in enhancing a spiritual awareness or an internal focus, it's going to aid me in being more productive. If I feel anxious, connecting potentially to the divine or seeking inner peace, that's potentially an antidote to anxiety. And so I think all of these topics that we've talked about are like pitfalls or things that people struggle with or whatever. I couldn't help but kind of all of a sudden grasp like a sense of spirituality, a sense of purpose, a sense of moral judgment, really does or could profoundly impact many of the other things that we've been talking about.
I could see it being like you're describing this. It's like the ibuprofen that just kind of can go to wherever you need, some type of relief or help or something. And I think that's why it's persisted for so long too, and seems to just be a kind of innately human thing. Even people who, maybe grew up in a religious situation and then left a church, or just feel like, they've, or people who say they're atheists or something and are saying they're taking steps away from religiosity in general. I think everybody to some extent finds a way of, how do I relate to the world? How do I make sense of meaning? How do I direct how I want to live and the kind of person that I want to be? And in a way, somehow create their own tiny religion. And I think the reason for the universality of it is exactly what you're saying, is that there's all these areas of our lives that we find ourselves wanting some extra help, some strength, some guidance, some way of persevering, some way of attending to, I'm scared of this or I'm unsure of this thing. And so I think we kind of feel like there's an innate need for a system that could get us through those difficult things, or even help us make use of the positive things too. So I think that's why it's there. Like, we have this propensity for that automatically, even if we don't very explicitly subscribe to something.
Yeah, I was thinking about like too, if you look at like every major like culture or community or whatever, they set rules or guidelines or laws or whatever, and in some sense it begs the question, well, like how do they come up with these things? And I think a big part of it is like what do we deem to be moral? What do we deem to be good? Oftentimes we sacrifice individual freedom for a sense of larger community goodness, and I think I think that's guided by these principles of like morality and justice and meaning making, and what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to fit in with society? And so I think, again, you talked about like the universality of it, and you can kind of see that across the spectrum in every major culture that has existed. It does make me wonder or curious about, so if we're saying spirituality is kind of a fundamental guiding and essence, how do we, I don't even know how to frame the question except for to say like, how do we get better at it? How do you develop this like attunement to spirituality? How do you make sure that you're kind of moving in the right direction? How do you know that you're listening well or being a good steward of, whatever the language is that's associated with that? But like, how do you get it?
I think that's a really great question. And it's actually something I've thought about, because so many clients actually can come to therapy either wanting to enhance their own spiritual, religious identity, or they just have these really big questions that they want answers to, questions that are normally answered by a faith or a spiritual understanding. And so I think it's really relevant to a lot of people. How do you get better at this, or how do you better define these types of things? And I think a huge part of it is, kind of ironically, the want to do something with that, the want to define those things. I think that automatically makes a huge distinction and sets you in motion. If you have you just have this thing on your heart where you're like, I want to define what it means to be a good person for myself. I want to have a way of knowing I'm living in the right way and on track for the right things, and that I have some type of purpose. Because I think the only people who find purpose in life are the people who say, I want purpose. I don't think these are accidental things. And even if you do the fulfilling good stuff, if you never set the intention in the first place, I think you miss getting the full capacity of it. You miss the meaning making of it. You miss that feeling of I'm doing this or I'm being this. So I think a huge part of that is just saying that that's what you want. And that, I think that leads to and builds up this ingredient of intention, which is what all of this to me feels like it's about. If you're intentional in that, that opens all the doors for you. You could be anything you want to be, live any type of life you want to live, if you're being intentional. And this specific type of intention says, here's how I want to live, here's how I want to be, here's how I want to relate to people, here's the meaning that I want to find in my life. And I think the thing about meaning is it doesn't happen without any type of acknowledgement or intention. It can just fly by if you're not able to stop and say, here's how I make sense of things, here's the meaning that I want from things.
A couple of things came to my mind as you were talking, and I think I really like the idea of intention, right? In some sense, it's like pause and think, like in some sense, ask those big questions of like, what am I supposed to do with this life? Like, what is the meaning of my time here on the earth? Just asking those questions can then guide you one way or the direction or the other of like, how do I want to make sense of this? And so I think that intentionality of just like, and curiosity around kind of some of those big questions can guide that. But it also reminded me of, and I think this is a really important thing, way back when we started doing those possibilities, we did a possibilities about smallness and humility. And I think that I kind of feel like this is coming full circle, because I think spirituality, we talked about it like kind of guiding how we interact with other people and how we, involve ourselves with the community. But I think in some sense, spirituality also does way more than that. It asks us to consider like, how are we connected to the world? How are we connected to the cosmos? How are we potentially connected to, supreme beings that aren't even here on this world? And all of a sudden, when you think about like the concentric circles of like, it can get so big, and all of a sudden we're sitting in a very small, like humble place. And we talked a lot in that episode of the possibilities around how there's such benefit in kind of acknowledging you're one small piece in so much grandeur. And so I think in some sense too, it's like taking that in, taking stock of there's so much expanse out there, and I, in my own little way, could send ripples through all of those concentric circles. And what kind of ripple do I want to send? How, and if there are kind of these concentric circles, like what ripple is the earth sending to me? What ripple are other people sending to me? If the divine or the supreme, what ripples am I getting from that entity? And I just think as we consider those things, and we consider our own smallness, it does guide, it kind of sets those, like you were talking about, like meaning and intention. I can decide how do I want to interact? How do I want to be influenced by all the possible things that are out there? And I think we could easily coast through life never thinking about or considering those things. And life might be fine. But I think when we boil it down to meaning making, if we pause to think what additional meaning could be made by considering all of this like expanse, perhaps that could really enrichen our experience as we kind of move through life.
All of that makes me think of, I've seen like a lot of like college students and even high schoolers for therapy, and I feel like that's such a very peculiar developmental period for people where they're like defining themselves and defining how they look at the world, and so a lot of the similar questions can come up, and I'm wondering how you would describe your response to this, because oftentimes they'll come with, some version of, you referenced this earlier, what's the meaning of life, or what's my purpose, so how am I supposed to align all the big decisions that I'm going to be making, and I'm not asking you for the meaning of life, though maybe I should. I'd be curious to hear your answer, but I am asking, how do you find your own sense of the meaning of life, and or your own sense of those types of big questions, and then how do you know when you're getting a good prototype together, when you're getting an answer to that, when you're like, okay, I think I'm figuring it out, I think I've found something that can stick and I can use.
Yeah, I mean, that's a giant question.
It is. That's why doctors in front of your name.
So I'll do my best to kind of summarize, and I guess I should probably be really explicit and say, like, this is my own personal experience of this. But I think for me, when I think about like how do you know, kind of grasp like this is the purpose, and this is I think for me there's a couple of things. One, I try to seek knowledge and information from as many reliable sources as I can. And for me, I'm a particularly religious person, so consulting religious texts, not just like standard religious texts, but like commentary on how other people have made sense of these religious books and doctrine, and trying to align, okay, so where does my personal feeling align with, what other people are seeing? But not just my own religion, trying to understand as many of the other religions or faith principles or values that I come across, right? Approaching those things with curiosity, and in some sense, being open to variety. I think valuing difference instead of saying like you're wrong. I think just being open to difference then lets me kind of weigh in a more curious manner. What of that can I take? What of that do I feel like I don't want to take? And by holding that stance, I have found there's a considerable overlap with various Muslim faiths and how they live their lives, and that aligns with the way that I've chosen to live my life. A lot of Buddhist practices, again, like intentionality and meditation and those kinds of things, I can see value in those things. And so I try to take from wherever I can to say, I'm gonna try to move in the direction that feels the best for me. But then I value so much like science and experiment and knowledge and all of those kinds of things. So I try to read books and gain understanding. And for me, from my religious perspective, there's a quote that was given by one of our, former leaders way back. And he said, all truth is circumscribed into one great whole. And so to me, it doesn't matter like where it's coming from, if it's coming from science or if it's coming from religion or whatever. If I can make sense of it, if it fits into a pattern, and I have to acknowledge and realize a lot of this probably is my own meaning making of like how I've chosen to make meaning. Some things are going to adhere to that and some are not. So I think a lot of what we talked about around like setting intention I had to sit down and say, like, what do I really value? Things like personal growth and development, that's important to me. Family is really important to me. Connecting to the divine is really important to me. And so when I find things that align with those things that I value, I try to make sense of it. I try to put it into the whole and say, I've never considered that. How does it fit into the whole? And so I think it's a mix of setting the intention and being open to new information, approaching things with curiosity. I have to be really honest and say it's almost like the balance of brain and heart or gut or, whatever you want to call it. It's when the two align, then I say, okay, that I'm going to move in that direction. It feels good. It sounds good. It makes sense. I'll move in that direction. I think this is a really long, rambly answer. I'll try to wrap it up here. But I think the other thing that I would say is purposefully trying to travel, to visit places that are different, expose myself to new cultures, new religions, new racial groups, all kinds of things, has just, I think, opened appreciation. And I think that's, the other component is like, whenever there's like a piece that kind of feels like it locks into the overall puzzle, I think just approaching that with appreciation and saying like, I'm so grateful that I learned this from these people, or I got to experience this with this particular person. And I feel like the more I move through life with this sense of like gratitude, the more, I don't know how to say it, except for the more goodness seems to come. So I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Answered all the questions.
But that seems to be like how I kind of develop my own spirituality and move through life.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what was key in all of that is it sounds like you tried to be as thoughtful and ongoing to try to be as thoughtful as possible about all of the ways that this can infiltrate everything and not just let it be a specific compartment of your life, but be in sync with all the areas of your life, as well as all of the areas that you get information and meaning from. And I think that's helpful too, because it seems to me that if something is meaningful, if something is true, if something is worth putting your effort and your intention into, it should be kind of globally true, right? That meaning should ring like constantly throughout everything that you do. I'm not just being a kind person during office hours or something, or only when I'm, feeling well or something. I'm not just being generous. I'm not just thinking about the long term or about family or about community. Only in these conditional moments and places and times. It's that if I define myself in a certain way and say I want to live a certain way and say I want to find meaning in these certain ways, that kind of has to always be true. Even if I feel like I'm seeing myself fall short, I still have to feel like, no, that's still true. I just happen to be having a bad day or a bad week, or there's just things I need to work on to move towards that. I can't turn it off or be blind to it. I have to say, this is all still here. This is all still true. It just so happens that maybe I'm not being the best example of someone who values those things. Anything else about?
No, I think that you captured it. I guess I would just flip the question back at you, right? I don't assume that you have navigated this whole process in the same way that I have. I guess that's the question of like, where does it align with you? Where does it differ from the way that you kind of move through life?
Well, I think the universality of it is what feels like it lines up for me. I don't think I ever sought out to say I want this particular religion or this particular way of looking at the world. I think I started with, I knew I want to be this type of a person. I want to live in a way that I contribute more good than bad to the world. I want to make the most use of my abilities, the gifts and things that I feel like I've been given, the privileges that I feel like I've been given. I want to be as honest as possible, as kind as possible. So I just had these like basic ingredients of here's the kind of person that I want to be. without saying here is, or what religion should I subscribe to, or what what direction should I go in, and I feel like that helped me know myself so well that eventually that evolved into its own understanding, I guess. And I've been happy to learn from different areas and learn from different people, like you were saying, different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and to be able to maybe even take pieces of that and say, yeah, that feels like that's true and that fits, and I think everybody should subscribe to that in some sense of a way. But I think my general feel of it is I don't need to squeeze too tightly on anything as long as I stay open and stay committed to trying to be those things. And I said I want it to be. And if that lands me in a certain place religiously or formally, then I'm happy to be there. But if it doesn't, then I also don't feel like that's a problem either. As far as like answering those big questions that we kind of started this chunk of the conversation with, the meaning of life and all that stuff, I since I was very young, I think I was just comfortable with, well, I don't know, and that's fine. Maybe eventually I'll figure it out, but I'm fine with not knowing for now.
One of the things that I love about your answer, and I think this is a really important component, is there's almost a juxtaposition of, and use the words like, I know myself so well. And I think a really healthy sense of spirituality requires that, of like, I know myself, I know what I value, I know what I don't value, I know what I deem to be right and wrong, and all of those kinds of things. And so I think that there's amazing certainness in like, I know me. And then you kind of at the end kind of came to this like, but all of these big questions and the meaning of life, I'm okay with not knowing. And that's such an interesting dynamic of like, I know me, but I don't know all of this. And knowing me is enough to kind of wade through the ambiguity of all of this. And I think that really does, that, dichotomy helps to kind of frame all of this. If I know me, I know how to take the next step, or when something comes along, I can navigate that. But I don't have to know the end result. I don't have to know exactly where I'm going to end up, but I know how to take each step as it comes.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant summation of this whole conversation, right? There isn't, I don't think, I'll let anyone else feel free to be open to believe whatever they want to believe, but I don't think there's an instantness to any of these meaning-making systems. There's no way to jump to the end or to be the perfect thing or to fully embody whoever it is you want to be or what kind of lifestyle you want to live. I feel like all of these are processes. If you say, I subscribe to this, I believe this, here's my meaning-making system, here's my religion, here's whatever, you're saying, here's the path that I want to see myself on, and here's the ways I want to guide myself as I walk down that path. But you're still on a path, and at some point, you're very well near the beginning of that path, and I don't even know what it means to get to the end of that path. You're just going in that direction. So I think what you just described really perfectly sums all of that up, and it's you just got to take it one step at a time. You just got to say that I'm going over here, and I'm trying to be this kind of person as I head in that direction, and I can't get too bogged down with, I don't know what everything down there looks like yet, or I don't have all the answers yet. I just know me and who I want to be and who I'm trying to be.
Yeah, I think the implications of that are really profound, right? I think a lot of mental health concerns or troubles probably come from either not knowing myself well enough, or being too caught up on what is the end, right? I think a lot of anxiety is like, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens? What if a lot of depression or self-esteem issues come from like, I'm not at the end, or I'm not good enough to make it to the end, or I can never make it to the end, and I think that holding that juxtaposition of like, I know me, and I'm okay taking one step at a time. I think maybe in all of this, that's kind of what we're trying to pursue, is self-awareness and being able to manage ambiguity a bit.
Yeah, we kind of referenced the like unconditionality of these things. If you really are subscribing and believing and making meaning in these types of ways, it's not just on, you know, Mondays or on days where the sun is shining or when things are easy. It's always, you know, there's not a condition to it or a prerequisite for it. And so if that's the case, then it kind of doesn't matter what does happen. The what ifs don't really matter.
Yeah.
The absolute worst case scenario could start to unfold. And I've still got to be or try to be the person that I said I want to be. I've still got to believe in the things that I said I believe in. I've still got to value the things that I said that I value, even if it's really, really hard. And that might test those values, but that's the whole point, I guess, is that you have those things, you subscribe to them, and so you're putting them to the test constantly.
Yeah, and I think maybe the final thing I'll say that you kind of sparked for me is throughout history, people who seem to walk that line are people who we admire, who we revere. Like I think about like Martin Luther King, right? He knew himself, he knew what he stood for, he knew what he valued, he knew, and he advocated for those things throughout his life. But he also knew there's trouble that could come as a result of this. I don't know what the end, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to do this, but I just know that this is what I value and I'm going to move in that direction. I think of other people, you know, like Mother Teresa. She lives in, you know, abject poverty all around her. And she could easily get caught up on why is this the plight of all of the people? But instead she just said, like, I'm just going to go through life loving people and taking care of people and trying to relieve suffering in whatever way I can. And I don't know if that's going to make a big difference in the end or not, but I know me, and I know that's what I value, and I know and so I think about like people who really stand out as like worth admiring. It seems like they've struck this balance of like, I'm grounded in what I'm trying to do in life, and I'll take the hits as they come.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, is that the hardest examples of those seem to propel people into the spotlight of someone who's really, really admirable if they still cling on to the unconditionality of here's what I believe and here's what I value, even if things get unimaginably hard.
Yeah, good point. Anything else you wanted to add?
I think we solved spirituality. We answered all the questions.
Every single one.
Yeah.
In the face of ambiguity. But hopefully that was meaningful to you. We would love to hear your thoughts about this idea around spirituality. How do you formulate your own sense of spirituality? How do you foster that? But in addition, if you can think of somebody who would benefit from thinking about this, considering these ideas or topics, please feel free to share this with them. It would mean a lot to us if we could engage more and more people in these kinds of conversations. So please stay engaged with us, and we really appreciate your help and support. And as you go throughout life, hopefully you can do it in a more meaningful, intentional way.